Wow, this house is cute. But can I really get in the game in this economy? I do have savings, and I am responsible-ish. Ugh, I should bury it. I'm being wild. But what if I'm not being wild, though? Could I actually score a...
Kick off your home buying journey with Zillow's new BuyAbility tool. It makes it easy to find out what you can afford, so you can get off the bench and onto the playing field with confidence. Check your BuyAbility, only on Zillow.
Saturday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Saturday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Saturday. Saturday, bring it on.
Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Hey everyone, it's Kavitha Davidson, and welcome back to Sportly. In today's episode, we're going to be talking everything college basketball, the excitement of March Madness coming up, latest tournament buzz, and what to watch for as Selection Sunday approaches in a couple of weeks. Our guest today is Nicole Auerbach, a college basketball and football insider for NBC Sports, one of the most respected voices covering the NCAA, a former colleague of mine and a friend. If you're a fan of March Madness or the Olympics, you've likely come across her expert analysis and in-depth reporting. She's built a really impressive career covering college sports and other things, previously writing for The Athletic and USA Today, and she was named a National Sports Writer of the Year by the National Sports Media Association in 2020. As we record this episode on Wednesday, March 5th, we're about a week and a half away from Selection Sunday, so teams are making their final push for tournament bid. We're going to talk to Nicole about her journey in sports journalism and what to watch for in this year's March Madness. So Nicole, welcome to Sportly. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me and such a kind introduction.
Well, very quickly, how are you doing? I know you've got a wedding coming up. I know you just had a bachelorette party. We kind of talked about this a little offline, but one of the things that people don't realize about people in our industry is that you have to plan whole life events around the sports calendar.
100%. So I'm getting married in the middle of May, and everyone I've talked to about this who works in college football or the NFL is like, I got married in May. It's a very good time of the year for the football calendar. But yes, thank you. Just got back from the Bachelorette, which was right after the NFL Combine, but right before the push for March Madness. So yes, there's a lot of considerations that have to come into play with these jobs because, they're very much, 365 days a year, 24/7 now, especially college sports. I know we're going to get into kind of NIL and the business of college sports, but it really has been year round for at least 5 years now, with just so much happening as like kind of the sports landscape changes under everyone's feet. Plus then you throw in the usual actual fun sporting events like March Madness.
Right. In addition to covering the actual things that are happening on the court or on the field, you're also following Supreme Court litigation and things like that.
Yes. Yeah. And many congressional hearings on NIL.
Well, we will get into that, obviously, but can you just take us back to when you first started covering sports? When did you know this is what you wanted to do with your life?
So I feel like there's so many people in our industry who always knew, and like they have all these stories about how, they were writing up little game stories when they're 5 years old and holding little karaoke mics and trying to interview people. Not at all. That was not my story. I thought I was going to go into business. I was very math and sciencey through high school, and I really just stumbled into it at college. I went to the University of Michigan, and I was talking to some friends during, move-in week, welcome week, making a friend across the hall. So she was a sophomore, and I was just saying like my dream job would be to write for Sports Illustrated, and she said her dream job would be to be like a heart surgeon, and she did. She went to med school, like she became a doctor, and my goal was obviously a lot less like altruistic, not really saving lives, but she had said, hey, you should do that. Like you should go to the student newspaper, the Michigan Daily. My friend's a news editor there. And I hadn't really made the connection that like these were real people. I would get my Sports Illustrated, flip to the back, read Rick Riley first. But like, it was just kind of like a larger than life person to me, and not like, oh, here, if you start point A, you can eventually get to point B as a career path. So I went to the meeting. It was the day after App State beat Michigan, which was my first college football game. And I went to this meeting. Michigan, it's an entirely student-run newspaper, no faculty advisors. You really just learn by doing. And I'm sitting in this meeting and I'm watching these 4 seniors who are on the football beat just completely tear up this special section that they had, which was because, Chad Henne came back, Mike Hart came back, Jake Long came back. Like they were supposed to compete for a national championship that year. This was 2007 season. And they tear it all up, and it's kind of like, oh, what the hell happened? How did App State beat Michigan, the biggest upset in college football history? And I just thought it was so awesome that they got to be experts, that these were seniors in school covering their peers. They went to all the media availabilities, like they were analyzing and writing this definitive piece about it, even though again, they're just seniors in college. So I thought that was really interesting and something that I was attracted to. So I signed up for like a club ultimate Frisbee story, had no idea what I was doing, had to shadow someone, to cover a game and see like what they did, how you interview people, how to write a story, how do you structure it, what's a lead, all of these different things. And so I just kind of learned by doing. You're making friends in college, you're trying to find clubs and organizations to attach yourself to. So I went from there. But really the moment that I realized it was something that I wanted to do and pursue, despite everyone being like, oh, the industry is dying, journalism is dying, which, was certainly the refrain when I graduated in 2011, still is today. But
we've been hearing this for 20 years, and I don't know if the refrain's gotten any better, but
20 years. I was seeing people who I knew who worked really hard, who were really talented, like they were finding jobs. So the summer after my freshman year, I interned at the Trentonian, Trenton, New Jersey. And I was covering like Little League baseball, Little League softball, a 12 and under age group that like fed into the World Series. I covered drag racing, which for people who don't know is like a 3-second race. So I had to figure out how to write about that. I covered high school sports. I did some Trenton Thunder, who then they were the Yankees AA team. I don't know. Are they still in the Yankees organization?
They're called something else now, but it's still the same kind of organization. And they were very famous for their bat dog who passed away.
Yes. So I did like a mix of all of those things. And that was the first time. I mean, it was just every day writing on deadline, every day showing up at usually a ballpark because it was the summer, not really knowing what your workday looked like. You didn't know what you were going to write about, who you were going to interview, what the story was going to be, and watching it unfold. And really like the reason I figured out that this was something I wanted to do is I didn't feel FOMO. All my friends had like normal jobs. They're hanging out every night. I was working nights and weekends. And I loved it. So it kind of went from there. And then I had different internships, including at USA Today and the Boston Globe. Started my career at USA Today and then The Athletic and all the jobs that you mentioned. But yeah, I stumbled into it. And so I always tell people, and especially students, like, I didn't major in journalism. Michigan doesn't have a journalism major, doesn't have a journalism school. This is a career path that you can learn by doing. And I think that that's really cool.
Yeah, I love that. And whenever I talk to students, I always feel like a little bit of a fraud as well, because they're usually in journalism school. And I did not go to journalism school either.
I'm like, what are you guys studying? Like, how do you get through the whole day?
I mean, I don't want to sound like, old man yells at cloud, but I think that there is some value in it because some of that stuff is stuff that we learned in just regular school. And I don't know if, the fundamentals of essay writing are being taught the same way these days, and sourcing and things like that. But you're right. It is one of those professions that you very much can learn by doing. The reason that my college didn't offer journalism undergrad is because they considered journalism vocational, which is hilariously elitist.
Interesting.
But I love when you're talking about all of the smaller sports and like drag racing, some of the more obscure sports that you covered, because I think the other thing that is probably the best way to train on the job is to cover a sport that you don't know anything about, because you're not necessarily supposed to be an expert.
No. And I actually think that that's something that bothers me, now that like so many press conferences and things are televised, when you see people who are like asking a question kind of just to prove that they know something. Like that's not the point of interviewing or asking questions after a game. You're trying to get that person's perspective or that person's explanation for something. And I am completely with you. I think it's really humbling in general. It teaches you how to research and prepare. So I've covered 3 Olympics, and my first one was London. I got thrown on swimming. Swimming was my beat. So I was like cramming and studying for swimming. When swimming was over, my editors were like, great. Here's what you're doing today. The next day, here's what you're doing today. Like, one day I got to run quotes like Usain Bolt, which was awesome. I got to like see him, like a quick sliver of Usain Bolt. But one day they were just like, okay, here's an American who is up for gold in pole vaulting. I did not know the rules. I did not know how the sport worked. I'm cramming based on the history of the sport and the almanac that used to exist for Olympics. And then I get over there and I'm trying to learn the rules, like the scoring system. By the end, I'm there with like an LA Times writer. I'm there with a couple other people. And I'm like, oh my God, she just won. Jen Sir just won. They're going to default to their scores from the previous round. And she cleared it and no one else did or whatever, whatever it was. Everyone's looking at me like I have 3 heads, but I was right. She did win based on the order of the scoring that I had figured out. And that's when I was like, yes, nailed it. And like, then, again, who's going to read this story? I don't know that anyone knows how pole vaulting works. So you explain briefly, the jargon and what exactly happened. But I wrote about her just running around super emotional, an American flag, embracing with her husband, coach, the human part of these stories. So I think that is so helpful to go through. To have to give yourself a crash course in something you're unfamiliar with, be okay asking questions that might sound dumb, and then figuring out like, what is the human interest in this story? Like what is going to grab people who, like me, 6 hours ago, may not have known all the technical pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's also extremely good advice. This particular podcast is for people who may or may not be huge sports fans, and towing that line, no matter what you're covering or no matter what you're talking about. I say this if you're covering finance, if you're covering big tech, you have to assume an audience of all kind of skill levels and all knowledge levels. And I think that when you're coming at it from such a fresh perspective, that really helps there. So as somebody who has covered 3 Olympics and multiple March Madness tournaments and huge events, what has been your favorite singular event to cover?
The event, like the overall event, is the Rio Olympics for swimming. So this was 8 days and there were, I think, 36 world records set in that pool. Like it was crazy. It was fast. And there were just incredible story. So it's the end of Michael Phelps, really the emergence of Katie Ledecky. You had Cold War battles with Russia in the breaststroke. You had 36-year-old sprinter Anthony Irving win gold. Simone Manuel, a tie for gold in the 100 free. There were just so many incredible stories. So I just don't think an event will be topped. The actual game and moment that I always say is my favorite was Villanova, UNC, national championship game. And this was the Chris Jenkins shot. But as you remember, Marcus Page hit an unbelievable shot right before. So it was like back to back, these dueling, incredible, iconic moments. I honestly have no idea how I reacted to them. Like that time was just like, I think I blocked it all out. Like I obviously was writing 2 different game stories of like North Carolina wins, Villanova wins, and finished it. Like it went out. USA Today sent a push alert. I don't remember any of that. I just like remember like, the jaw-dropping moment of both of those shots back to back. So that game was my favorite individual game.
I think those are both incredible answers. A true East Coast girl with a Villanova shout out on there, but obviously.
Hey, Jay Wright's a Jersey Shore guy, and that's really where this comes down to. I'm a Jersey Shore girl. 100%.
And I'm a Knicks girl, and Jalen Brunson was on that team, so I will always take that answer.
The Nova Knicks, basically, they are Villanova in NBA form, so it's as close as we got.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills, Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
So it's hard to do a podcast like this so far out from Selection Sunday and actually talk about predictions, but I'm going to try. We're recording this, as I mentioned, about a week and a half from Selection Sunday. We had a pretty major upset just last night. Texas A&M stunned Auburn in a game where A&M basically led the entire time. Auburn is ranked number 1 right now in the AP poll. Was this a sign that the Tigers are fallible?
I'm not that worried about it. I think there were, injury and availability issues in this game that, hopefully are not an issue for them moving forward. Jedi Broom even, had a banged up shoulder issue that he had earlier in the season as well, that, he didn't play his best. And he's a player of the year candidate, him and Cooper Flagg at Duke. So no, I think that there are so much better than a lot of really good teams in college basketball this year that I would be shocked if they're not in the Final Four. I think they're going to be the number 1 overall seed based on the schedule compared to Duke and what they've had to go through the gauntlet in the SEC. And I completely trust them. I know they've lost some games in maybe an unprecedented league, right? Like this is a league that's trying to get the most NCAA tournament bids in a single tournament. They're trying to break the record that the Big East set with 11. So there is a unique challenge there. There is a unique wear and tear. You do get everybody's best shot when you're the number 1 team in the country for most of the year. So no, I'm not too worried about them as long as they're healthy.
Yeah, everyone else's play raises to the level when they're playing Auburn, basically.
100%. And, you have Bruce Pearl as their head coach. He's very experienced. He's built Auburn up to this point. I mean, when we talk about the SEC teams, and this is a narrative that I think is really important as you look at the bracket, as the field, when you're filling this out, and you're going to be tempted to put a lot of SEC teams in the Sweet 16 and maybe into the Final Four. This league is now the most dominant basketball league. Like this was a football part of the country. Football league did not invest, did not care as much about men's basketball. And now they are dominant. They have great coaches. They have great resources. They have really funneled a lot of support into these sports. And Auburn hiring Bruce Pearl was part of that. I mean, and that forced everyone else to hire better and invest better to keep up after they made the Final Four for the first time.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that because I think too much has been made, but it has been a narrative of this year in the college football playoff, there being much less SEC representation than we are used to seeing in previous years, obviously with a much different and expanded playoff pool. And we're seeing basketball go in kind of the opposite direction. Is there an institutional reason for the SEC maybe investing more in basketball or, just wanting to turn around their reputation in that space?
Yeah, it really goes back to, I think the year was 2014, and it was still Mike Slive, the commissioner. But, there was a stretch there when I first was covering college basketball primarily, where it was Kentucky, Florida, and that was kind of it. Like sometimes Tennessee would pop a little bit, but like it was a huge drop off. And you could basically just circle the Kentucky, Florida games and you were like good on the regular season in the SEC. And, they hired Mike Tranghese, who had obviously had a lot of ties with the Big East. And they had like league-wide meetings to figure out how to get better at basketball. So there was a concerted effort with scheduling. The way that college basketball works and resumes work used to be the RPI, now it's the net. But these are data and analytics, and you can not manipulate it, but you know how it works. So if you're thinking about your non-conference schedule and you don't really care, maybe you're scheduling the absolute worst teams in Division I, and then you beat them. Great. But that pulls down a lot of the metrics in your resume. And then that pulls down the metrics of the opponents in the SEC that you play multiple times because they're all interconnected. So there's just like a lot of strategy involved in scheduling that really helps boost it. Not even just like, oh, should you schedule, Big 12 teams? More just like you're looking at the teams that you think are going to win like the SoCon. Teams that you think are going to finish near the top of their leagues, because then they'll have a lot of wins and that will help boost your resume. So there was like a scheduling philosophical piece to this that everyone had to adhere to. And then, yes, they had to hire better. They had to devote resources. This is actually part of the reason that their women's basketball programs got better too across the board, because if you're redoing your men's basketball facilities, you're also redoing your women's basketball facilities. And so you started to see that across the board on both sports really increase because, prior to being able to pay players, everyone had to recruit based on, the coaches you had and the facilities. Like those were the big draws. And so everyone elevated in those areas. And then people paid to retain the good coaches. So it's been a lot of different pieces, but certainly now in a world where football drives so much, men's basketball, and in a lot of places now it's growing, women's basketball can be revenue drivers. Makes a lot of sense to devote resources to that and to make sure that those players are getting their NIL money, that like when there's a revenue share, that their players are going to get paid too, because it is the second most important sport on these campuses and a lot of these campuses. So it was definitely a concerted effort at the start. But now that we're here, you can connect the dots of how we got to the depth and the breadth of the SEC basketball experience.
Right. And, we'll absolutely get to the women's game. But finally, on the men's side, Auburn seems like a lock, obviously, Cooper Flagg and in Duke. What are your predictions? Or are there any surprises that we should be looking out for? I know that we're still about a week and a half out, but what are you looking for on the 16th?
The number one seeds I think we're going to see, which again, don't at me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's going to be Auburn as the number one overall seed, Duke. And then I think Houston and Tennessee is the last number four overall seed, the last number one seed. There was some chatter for some time about potentially 3 SEC teams on that top line, but Houston is so, so good. Kelvin Sampson's been one of the best coaches in the sport for a number of years now. This might be his best team. He's also had some teams that have been really, really talented and then had bad injury luck heading into March. But this is a group that I think winning the Big 12, which has been the class of college basketball for a couple of years. And Big East people don't get mad at me, but just the depth, it's impressive. They're so tough defensively. And then, obviously you have to have the offensive production to go with it. So anyway, that's what I think the top line will look like. The bubble is always going to be interesting. I think storylines to track that depends how the bracket gets set up. But Rick Pitino and the reemergence of St. John's is absolutely a major storyline heading into March, in case people aren't aware.
Thank you for organically going there, because as the New York girl, I didn't want to just bring it up, but
no, it's a huge. Rick Pitino has won everywhere he's coached. He has had scandals, yes, but like the high risk, high reward, it's absolutely there. And, for them to do what they've done in the Big East, dethrone some of these teams like the UConn's down after their back-to-back championships, but absolutely story of the season.
Based on a total roster rebuild, basically.
And do you remember last year, it was maybe February, where he just said, like, this sucks, I hate this, like, I'm the most miserable I've ever been as a coach about my team. Like, he is just one of one, but it works. It gets results. And so, yeah, St. John's is going to be a team that no matter where they're seated, no matter what their path looks like, we're going to be talking about them on Selection Sunday and through that, at least the first week of March. So they're interesting. There's a couple other just like subplots. Indiana probably going to make the NCAA tournament, I think, with a little bit of margin. I think they're going to be able to avoid the first 4. They've already said Mike Woodson's not coming back, and they're in the middle of a coaching search. So that's interesting. So yeah, there's a lot of different subplots here, but the top feels very strong this year. Feels like there's a lot of teams that could win it all and it probably are cut above, but usually people give you like maybe 6 or 8 teams that can do it. Definitely feels like there's at least 8 teams capable of winning a national championship this year.
Well, it's why it's the madness, right? We can see kind of anything happen after favorites are sets.
This will be my prediction. I think we'll see less those big early round upsets, but we'll have like great Sweet 16 Elite 8 games. Because I just think maybe the sport's a little top heavy, which does bode well for some of those later rounds.
On to the women's game. This time last year, everyone was talking about Caitlin Clark, even though everyone should have also been talking about Dawn Staley and South Carolina. Obviously, we've got successors to the mantle now that Caitlin is in the W. Juju Watkins is gunning for National Player of the Year. Her USC Trojans are currently ranked 2nd behind Texas. What have you seen from her? She's so young, and from the team that has been built around her.
Yeah, she's so polished. This was something that I think people saw coming. The issue was last year, a lot of their games were buried. They were very late at night. I've lived in major US cities my whole life, and I've never had the Pac-12 network. So there were great USC, UCLA games last year that I couldn't see. So I think that this year was really her coming out party to the country. She was the National Freshman of the Year. She had amazing games where she could drop 50 points, and she's always capable of that. So she didn't sneak up on anybody. But what we saw this year is that full complete game. We saw the blocks, we've seen the steals, we've seen her handle being triple teamed at times against some of the best teams in the country and finding teammates. And so I think that they've done a good job of putting pieces together around her. We've seen sometimes, certainly in that first game against UCLA, which by the way, they swept both of the crosstown games in the regular season, where it felt like it was all her. No one else could make a basket, but you've got pieces around her to, they've added from the portal from actually within the Pac-12, last year was its last existence, in Kiki Iriafen and Talia Van Olahopsen, who I think, they're really experienced players and they're really able to complement what Juju does well. But yes, this team goes through Juju and they've figured out game plans when she is doubled and triple teamed. I talked to Lindsay Gottlieb, her head coach, a few weeks ago, and she's like, yeah, anytime I'm preparing for an opponent, I'll watch like their last 8 games and, be like, all right, they might do this, they might do this. And then they'll try something against Juju that they didn't show at all in film because everyone is just so hyper-focused on stopping her. But I think that it's so smooth. It looks effortless, the way that she drives to the basket, the way that she kicks it out. Just, again, the blocks have been absolutely part of the highlight reel. So she's been really, really special. We saw her carry that team deep through March last year, but they're trying to get to the Final Four for the first time since 1986. It's completely been a Caitlin Clark-esque story there, where the celebrities are going to the USC women's basketball games. We see them every single time. The ticket prices for their home and away games are going up. Juju is that show, and she's in all of those major commercials, major branding deals, just like Caitlin was. And so again, that's why I feel like this is a coming out party. If you didn't know her by a first name basis last year, you absolutely do this year. And if you're still a little behind, it's okay. Catch up now. You're going to see her do really special things during the NCAA tournament.
Absolutely. And I will say I was in LA a couple of weeks ago and USC was playing on campus, and just the crowd that was gathering around the stadium, not even just to go to the game or in bars around, like this was culturally an energy that continues to build and that we hadn't necessarily seen in previous years, but we absolutely are seeing now, and not just in huge basketball towns like LA, but around the country. Dawn Staley over at South Carolina is obviously building a little dynasty for herself. They are ranked 5th. They've got a ton of players returning from last year's championship team. What are there possibilities for the dynasty to expand any more? Where do you think the Gamecocks stand heading into this year's tournament?
Yeah, I mean, they're among the teams that can win it all. And this is where women's basketball has actually had its biggest growth, I think. Like, this was a sport that had no parity. It was just UConn, right, for so long. And then the best players started to disperse a little bit. Now there's more programs that are capable of winning it. And this year absolutely feels that way. I think they're in that grouping, but we've seen them get beat. We've seen them get beat pretty soundly by UConn. We've seen them get beat by Texas. Like, we've seen them get beat by the other contenders. But I think that's good for the sport, that no one's necessarily head and shoulders above everybody else, because the parity among like the top 6 to 8 teams is huge. And that's a step that this sport needed to take. It's why we've seen some great games in the Final Four rounds, the Elite Eight, the Sweet 16 games. We've even seen some of those first weekend upsets in a sport that typically didn't have them, because the depth is stronger than it's been. So South Carolina, I love watching Malaysia Fulwiley. She is so fun to watch. And they've got great players, as you mentioned, that all come back. But they did lose Camille Cardoso. And she was so important to the way that they played, certainly the way they won that national championship game. So it's going to be interesting to see how they respond. We've seen them lose, and we've seen them lose in ways that we're not used to seeing Dawn Staley's team lose. So how do they learn from that? How do they grow? And how do the individual matchups they draw end up mattering? But yes, it's very likely that if they're going to win this again, they're going to have to beat one of these teams that beat them during the regular season. And so that's what's really interesting about all of this is, even UConn crushing South Carolina, it was like, oh, wow, this is a moment about parity, which is so ironic because it was UConn crushing someone. But they have been down a little bit. South Carolina's been the gold standard. And we have not always seen teams like that lose in the regular season. South Carolina lost their home winning streak this year. They lost their SEC winning streak this year because people chase them. People are reaching their level. And that's what's going to be so fun about this, because you throw those two teams and Texas and Notre Dame, USC, UCLA, like there's so many teams that you could easily make a case to win it all, but they're going to have to go through each other And a lot of those teams actually played in the regular season, so you have some sort of blueprint. But that's what's fascinating. And the fact that South Carolina is beatable makes me even more excited for this NCAA tournament.
Right. And for those who aren't old enough to remember, sadly, UConn's perennial dominance in the women's tournament has constantly been used as an argument or a cudgel against the value of women's hoops. And now the tables have been turned, and it's kind of wonderful to see.
Every cup of Nespresso coffee is an invitation to transform your morning routine into a ritual you can treasure each and every day. Using the Virtuo Pup, a simple touch of the button freshly brews bold aromas and a rich, velvety crema layer for delicious cafe-quality coffee at home. Whether you enjoy your coffee hot or over ice, every sip, every morning is unforgettable. Nothing tastes like Nespresso coffee. Visit Nespresso.com or our app to explore our full range of easy-to-use machines and coffees not found anywhere else.
Hey guys, back at the playground again, huh?
Yep. You know what this playground could use? A wine country.
Heck yeah, and some waves, so we could go surfing. Oh,
yeah. Love that.
A redwood forest would be cool.
I'm in.
Ski slopes.
Let's do it.
Can a girl go shopping?
Yeah, baby.
Wait! Did we just invent California?
Discover why California is the ultimate playground at visitcalifornia.com.
We're going to talk a little bit about the business side of things because, as I said, you're spending as much time in congressional hearings and going over Supreme Court decisions as you are analyzing on-field and on-court statistics. There are a couple of settlements and House settlements that are waiting to be reconciled and things like that. Can you just, very kind of simply for our audience, break down where we stand on NIL and some of the legal battles that we've seen?
Yeah, so July 2021 was when the NIL era began. So it's name, image, and likeness. Basically, the ability to do an endorsement deal, to put your name on and face on anything. When you see like Caitlin Clark in a State Farm commercial, like that's what it's supposed to look like. It also spawned an entirely different like sort of salary world where NIL collectives for each fan base were essentially paying really whatever it took. So like it's not necessarily like you would really normally pay an offensive lineman like $400,000 to do like some charity events and like, sign autographs, but it was essentially paying them because you couldn't pay them salaries. So that's kind of the world we've lived in where collectives were kind of filling that gap of how do you help, entice someone to come play for you? How do you retain talent? The collectives stepped up and figured out what they were paying all of the different positions, all the different players. But meanwhile, by the way, the NCAA, very good. This is not pay for play, like, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a dichotomy and definitely like a push and pull between that where clearly the value and the reason that people are getting paid is their athletic ability. But technically, that's not what they've been paid for. That's going to shift because you mentioned the House settlement. That is kind of the colloquial term for 3 different lawsuits the NCAA was facing that they kind of combined, and it's in the final stages, final approval, and then some of the details that still need to get worked out. But it essentially, there's $2.8 billion of back pay for athletes that were not able to cash in on their NIL, dating back to, it's really like 2016, 2017. It's like as far back as the lawsuit was able to go. And then there's a forward-looking piece of this settlement that is creating a revenue sharing model. So that is set to begin this next academic year, so fall of 2025. And there's an annual cap. The schools can opt in and pay their athletes up to, it starts at around $21 million per year. I'm a fan of overall of the idea that schools pay their athletes directly instead of asking donors to. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Schools are the ones that are bringing in all of the money from their big media rights deals, from their ticket sales, like all of the benefit. The reason that coaches' salaries, the reason the facilities are so nice is because the schools are the ones bringing in the money. So they should be the ones to be paying out their players directly. And so schools are figuring out what that breakdown is going to look like. Are they going to do the maximum $21 million in year one? How much of that goes to football? How much of that goes to men's basketball, women's basketball? What if you have Olympic sports that are really dominant? If you're Oklahoma, softball, right? Like that should be, getting a slice of that as well.
Nebraska volleyball.
In baseball, a lot of the SEC schools. So there are a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and Title IX is also an unknown here. People are operating as if they can base this off of the back pay and the damages, which were heavily leaning towards football and men's basketball. But people have also wondered, like, hey, are there going to be lawsuits? Should this be 50-50? This is where the government comes into play, and the change, the past election, people who are going to be in charge of different departments. There's still just a lot of unknowns related to that. So again, you're seeing schools that are like, okay, we're going to earmark $12 to $14 million for football, 2 to 4 for men's basketball, a little under that for women's basketball, and the rest for our Olympic sports. Like, you're seeing people kind of start to either in letters to their donors or on their athletic websites, like, put out those numbers because it's important in recruiting, because they need to be able to tell their players that they're bringing in for next year or returning players what this is going to look like for next year. And also they're signing agreements that are technically not employment agreements, but sure look like employment agreements. So there's a lot of still moving pieces with this, but we are moving towards an era where the athletes are finally going to be getting the money directly from the schools that benefit from their ability to play and the games that they're part of that drive these massive media rights deals.
People obviously have a lot of opinions, and they always have, about the idea of college athletes being paid in any form. How have you seen these attitudes shift as somebody who's covered this for more than a decade?
They've definitely shifted. Turning point to me was Johnny Manziel. He wins the Heisman, and then he gets in trouble for signing his own autograph. He had to sit out half a game. And I was like, that just feels wrong. Like, he did so much. He was the face of the sport. He won the Heisman Trophy. And now you're not letting him do this one thing that literally anybody else could. Like, Kavitha, if you wanted to go sign autographs and sell them for $5 per autograph, you can do that. Anyone else at the school can do that. I think it reached a breaking point where it was just like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. There were a lot of outlets that were devoting time and resources to investigating like NCAA violations. And there would be a collective shrug of like, oh, somebody like bought someone dinner or gave somebody $200. Like, ooh, like, why are you being like a hall monitor for the NCAA, right? You're not breaking laws. So it just felt like we reached a breaking point. This is also around the time that coaches started to get paid $5 million per year, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? And it just felt so different. I think it felt way out of whack and way out of balance. And the public opinion absolutely shifted. And you saw that when California was the first law to propose, this NIL bill and to pay the players, at least through endorsement deals. And then there was like a race, and all the different states wanted to get out there because they were like, it's a competitive advantage. But you had Republicans being like, hey, the free market. You had Democrats being like, labor, they deserve to be paid. So you had like a lot of bipartisan reasons to support this type of legislation. So there was like a mad dash. States wanted to be first. They wanted to go do things. And we've lived in this world now for almost 4 years where it's existed. And again, we have coaches complaining, roster management has been very difficult. It's a lot of like game of telephone on what people are actually being paid. But the world kept turning and people keep watching college sports. All these people who thought that it was going to be somehow diminished if everyone knew that the athletes were making money. All of that was just fear mongering and did not affect the product. There's countless examples of ratings being up, breaking records. And it's also been a huge boost, I think, for women's sports, because I think that some of the highest earners and some of the most obvious examples of true NIL, like she is a spokesman for this thing because she's a huge draw, have been female athletes. So I thought the NCAA would have locked down on like these collectives and kind of like this skirting the rules to pay salaries part of it. But for the most part, it's gone the way that most people expected it would and did not harm, what college sports are about or people's attachments to their universities. People did not like mass cancel season tickets. People did not boycott and stop watching these games. If anything, they're more popular than ever.
Right. We've seen some coaches move schools, and they cite the difficulty of dealing with the transfer portal and NIL. Fans across the spectrum have complaints about what the transfer portal has become, using NIL as the reason or the argument for kind of the mess that we see now. What do you say to people from your informed perspective when they have those opinions?
Well, part of that's because these all happened at the same time. So you had the existence of the transfer portal, but there was a loosening of the rules so that it enabled people to be immediately eligible somewhere else. So there had been people fighting and tweaking and tinkering with the transfer rules for a really long time. So you had people who believed that they should be able to play right away, just like coaches do when they would leave a school and they could coach right away somewhere else. But you also had this legal pressure. You've had state attorneys general get involved on high profile cases where players were required to sit out for whatever reason. Economic rights are being hurt or diminished because they're not able to play. There's just like a lot of different reasons people have brought, but there's been a number of lawsuits related to these things. So basically, it just loosened it all up at the exact same time. So you had NIL, which wasn't supposed to be an inducement, but of course, if you can offer packages and deals while someone's making a decision about where to go to school, it becomes that. But you also had, again, the loosening of transfer rules so you could play right away. There were no rules restricting, you can't play somewhere in your conference anymore. Like there were so many strict, and in a lot of cases, archaic rules around player movement that all got loosened at the same time. And that's what made it more of a free for all. You now have athletes challenging the number of years that you have eligibility for. So there's so many things that are happening at the same time in a world where a lot of these legal cases against the NCAA were successful. So it was hard to enforce any rules around player movement in an era of player empowerment when so many of the courts were siding against the NCAA on a lot of these cases. So yes, roster management has been incredibly difficult. And that's actually why, like, if you move to an employee model, it's simpler. I think you're like, hey, you signed a 2-year deal. You're here for 2 years, or here's the buyout figures, right? Like that's how it works. But that's part of the reason when people even compare it to pro sports, it's not really apples to apples because, you could say, yeah, free agency, but there's still salary caps. There's still things that are negotiated in collective bargaining in pro sports that don't exist in college sports. And until we get there, you're still just going to have a lot of murkiness or the ability to move freely without repercussion, or, maybe somebody gets sued for breach of contract. But it's not like as strict and as uniform as it is in pro sports, which, by the way, the athletes help negotiate, right? In that collective bargaining, they have unions, they have representation in those conversations. So a lot of people would like college sports to get there. And there have been different types of efforts, different lawsuit and LRB cases and issues that are now actually kind of rescinded because of the current administration. But there are lots of different ways that we could eventually get there, but it's going to be difficult. And I think until then, you are going to have a lot of issues around roster construction because it's hard to really restrict, put rules and parameters around athletes' movement when they don't have a say in how the structure is set up.
Yeah, I mean, 2 things I heard from you there, and I do want to wrap with 2 questions specifically about this current administration and college sports. The first being, you mentioned unionization and employee status for college athletes. The NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, had deemed the Dartmouth men's basketball team employees, and that team was moving forward with a legal battle to gain the right to unionize. In December, they dropped that effort. Where do you see the future of labor relations, formalized labor relations in college sports? And do you think it is possible under this administration, or does it need a future administration to take hold?
It might need a future administration because the different paths that were all kind of happening in parallel, the NLRB path was one of them. There was also a joint employer case with USC, UCLA out west that was also rescinded because you don't have, a friendly agency and leadership there to kind of help make rulings and framework around those cases and those arguments. You do still have a judicial environment that is in the aftermath of the Alston decision. So that came down, you mentioned Supreme Court decisions. Each day that they were dropping decisions, I'm refreshing. And that's the one that said that schools can't cap academic related benefits for athletes. So it was pretty narrow, but if you remember, there was a lot of hoopla around this because it was a 9-0 decision against the NCAA. And Justice Brett Kavanaugh had a scathing concurring opinion. And he basically said, if any other business operated this way, we would 100% say, we need to break it up.
He used the word cartel, which is a word that advocates for college athletes have been using for decades to the scourge of people in Congress and people at the NCAA. It was really quite an incredible thing to see from Justice Kavanaugh.
It was. And he straight up was like, if a bunch of chefs in the same area banded together to say we're going to pay our chefs less because people say that the food tastes better knowing that they're not paid, we would say there's something wrong with this, right? We would say it's illegal. And so that has been the legal environment that a lot of these lawsuits and individual challenges have been working under, which is part of the reason the NCAA has lost a lot of cases. because, again, it's just a different world. They had certain benchmark rulings that they believed in and that gave them the ability to enforce and add rules and restrictions around different things in this model. And you're eroding some of that. So you still have, again, that path that some lawsuits are challenging. Even the House settlement, right? Even though it's a settlement, it is fundamentally shifting the model of college sports, like the business model itself, to a revenue sharing model, which some people thought would never happen. So right now, the NCAA is like, line in the sand is employee status. Everything that they ask for from Congress, everything that they talk about publicly is we don't want to make them employees. Like there's so many pieces that come with them being employees that we don't want them to do, but we want more money in their pockets and more benefits to them, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where the battle is right now. There's still a Johnson versus the NCAA case, which is a very interesting one that is challenging that athletes should be employees under the Fair Labor and Standards Act. So that is still ongoing. But you used to have that. You had the NLRB path, potential unionization efforts. It does feel like everything's taking a little bit of a backseat. And you have a Congress that might be open to helping the NCAA, whose argument is, hey, if you want to preserve college sports the way it's always been, all the things you value, including the opportunity to offer a lot of sports, opportunities for women because of Title IX, you need to help us by saying that athletes can't be employees. Which again, they all have money. They could choose to spend it in certain areas, but they are going to be spending it mostly on football, and then they might end up cutting other sports. But their argument is like, we need protections, we need help, and the key is that they can't be employees. So we'll see how those efforts go, because now you do have a Congress that can probably push some things through that don't need as much bipartisan support as they would have in the last 4 or 5 years that these hearings have taken place and various proposed bills. But there definitely are fewer avenues right now towards like what you're talking about collective bargaining, employee status, than it felt like a couple years ago. Not to say that it's not going to happen, but there are always going to be challenges with college athletes organizing on their own because of the turnover, that they're only in these schools for a short period of time, high profile football players and basketball players, like they don't want to be viewed as distractions, like these things get used against them when they're trying to get drafted and go pro. So there's a lot of still factors that come into play here that it's just too hard to predict. But, I would have said a couple years ago that like, we're going to end up there. It's just, we're not sure which path. And I still believe that we will eventually get to athletes as employees. And again, I think collective bargaining solves a lot of the issues around rule making and enforcing rules that are the issue right now. But I'm not sure exactly what path it's going to take to get there. And this Congress could have a say in it. I just don't know that it's a priority. I know they have hearings and you have people who get on soapboxes to talk about some of these issues.
There's always a lot of grandstanding in the name of college athletes, right?
Yes. And again, it's been years now and no one has really said like this is a huge priority to like throw the bone to the NCAA. So we will see. But in the meantime, as we continue to work through like these gray areas, I think the revenue sharing step is a huge one. And the fact that schools will pay their athletes directly is still something that a lot of people thought would never happen.
Absolutely. Finally, Nicole, everywhere I go in the last month and a half, people ask me, what is going to happen to Title IX under this administration? We did see, the Trump administration rescinded guidance. And I think that the language that we use to describe this is really important. It was guidance from the Biden administration that this revenue sharing for NIL apply equally under Title IX to women's sports as it does to men's. That was rescinded. None of these documents have been or were legally binding. And I think we're always kind of destined for the courts. What was your immediate reaction when you saw that news? And what do you think is the future of Title IX, at least in the next 4 years?
So I think that it is very much up in the air because we don't know what the Department of Education is going to look like and who is going to be in charge of figuring out how they want to enforce this, what they want it to look like. But I was not surprised that they rescinded it. And honestly, a lot of people were shocked, that the Biden administration even released the guidance and that they did it like 2 days before the inauguration. So everyone expected that it was going to be overturned or rescinded in the first place. But that was guidance that people have been asking for. They had been asking the Department of Justice. They had been asking the Department of Education for help around NIL. And there's lawsuits that are challenging some of this stuff. But people didn't know, do these deals need to be equal, 50-50? Scholarships, opportunities need to be 50-50 at these schools. But did the dollar amounts, did the number of deals with the revenue share, does it need to be, if it's $21 million, does it need to be $10.5 million and $10.5 million? People are not operating under that 50-50 split. So yes, it does feel destined for the courts to determine that about the actual money paid, if that falls under Title IX and the opportunities that it protects for female athletes. But yeah, I just think it's an unknown right now. And I think that people were always probably going to operate under the assumption that someone will get sued. And it might take a couple years to work this out. And no one wanted to fall behind competitively. So everyone would put most of the money towards football because you didn't want to do 10.5, fall behind for a couple years while the lawsuit gets worked out. So I think that's the world that we were always destined to be in. Someone's going to challenge it. We will find out what the courts say. But in the meantime, I think people are going to operate under the assumption that the money can go where the money is driven with those sports, even if they're predominantly male sports. So the scholarships remain even. So as people are adjusting the roster sizes of all their sports and figuring out if they're cutting any, if they're adding sports or scholarships, they are adhering to like the Title IX principles that they're supposed to about equal opportunities. But on the money side, people are not. And until we get all the way to the end of a challenge, a legal challenge, I don't know that we'll have that answer. But no one was surprised that that guidance was rescinded. And we're back in the same world where people think they know, like everyone's got their lawyers, everyone's got everyone on retainer, but we're going to operate that way until it gets challenged and we know for sure.
Yeah. School administrators trying to allocate resources is absolutely nothing new, but the confusion around it might be a little. And is there anything more American than saying somebody will be sued?
This is what college sports is. There have been a lot of lawyers who have made a lot of money in the last couple of years challenging the NCAA. So I wouldn't put my money on that stopping anytime soon.
Well, Nicole, thank you so much for joining me. It's so great to see you again. Good luck with March Madness coming up and good luck with the wedding, which is so exciting in May.
Thank you. It was great to be on with you. And good luck to everyone with your bracket pools. It's mostly a crapshoot, but I wish you all the best of luck.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Sportly. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with the incredible Nicole Auerbach, who is just a wealth of knowledge on pretty much everything you could throw at her. Sportly is an Immigrantly media production. This episode was produced by Sadia Khan. Our associate producer is Andrea Koskai. Our sound designer and editor is Paroma Chakravarti. Our theme music was created by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Tune back in next week and every week after for more Sportly.